Whose fault was it that the League of Nations failed to keep the peace in the 1930s? The League had been set up in 1919 to keep the peace following the Paris Conference, but by 1935 the League was discredited, and by September 1939 the world was staggering into war again. The visionary, idealistic Woodrow Wilson had pushed for the League. It would replace the secret diplomacy between nations which he believed had helped bring about the First World War.
There shall be no private international understandings of any kind. Diplomacy shall proceed always frankly and in the public view.
The League of Nations was based in a hotel in Geneva in neutral Switzerland. In the event of an international dispute, countries could bring their case to the League and it would judge what should be done. Noble intentions, but the League had a number of built-in weaknesses. It had limited powers to punish countries which didn't go along with its findings. It could, for example, decide on a trade boycott, but it had no army to enforce its decisions if a conflict threatened to turn into war. The League's governing body, the Council, didn't meet very often, and its decisions had to be unanimous. This meant it couldn't react quickly to events. Important countries with power and influence did not or could not join. Germany was told to demonstrate it was a peace-loving nation before it could apply. The revolutionary government of the Soviet Union was regarded with suspicion and was not admitted till 1934. And, most crucially of all, the USA never joined. Most Americans reckoned joining the League could involve them in more European wars, which they wanted to avoid. This attitude was known as isolationism. A prominent isolationist congressman said,
I object strongly to having the politics of the United States turn upon disputes where deep feeling is aroused, but in which we have no direct interest. Therefore, the less we undertake to play the part of umpire and thrust ourselves into European conflicts, the better for the United States and for the world.
Wilson tried to persuade his countrymen to join, but the isolationists won the argument. The USA stayed out of the League. Without the United States, the missing stone in this bridge, the League always lacked credibility. The permanent members of the League Council became Japan, Italy, Britain and France. As the most powerful states in the Council, it was down to Britain and France to lead the League of Nations. But they had their own priorities. The League of Nations was supposed to encourage disarmament, but neither country wanted to make any cuts in their own armed forces. France's priority was to protect itself against any future German aggression. One French delegate to the 1921 League Assembly put it that
we must keep our weapons in readiness. France is obliged to be military for the present and to continue to be so in order to avoid the resumption of war. She does not want to have lost 1.5 million lives for nothing.
And Britain's priority was to protect its trade and empire. To do that, it needed a strong navy and army. Britain tried to work with the League, but also continued to negotiate new treaties outside of the League, old-style diplomacy, which further undermined its effectiveness. The trouble was that the League's remit was to uphold the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, but by the mid-1920s, the mood of 1919 had changed. Germany wanted to renegotiate the treaty, and many people in Britain agreed that the treaty had been far too hard on Germany. The League did have some moderate success solving international disputes in its first decade. The 1920s was a decade of economic recovery in Europe, fueled by US loans, and international tensions had, by and large, eased off. But in 1929, the good times came to an end. Millions of people lost everything they had in the Great Depression after the Wall Street stock market collapsed and US banks called in their loans. Governments looked to their own country's interests. They couldn't afford to make any sacrifices. In this more difficult situation, the League's inherent weaknesses made it much harder for it to keep the peace. It was in the Far East that the League of Nations faced its first major test. The Japanese economy relied heavily on selling goods to China and the USA. During the Depression, both these countries imposed tariffs on imported goods to protect their own businesses. This made the Japanese goods too expensive. Japan was desperate for new markets abroad. Lieutenant Colonel Hashimoto Kingoro was one of the Japanese militarists who argued the only answer was to expand their own Japanese empire.
There are only 3 ways left to Japan to escape from the pressure of surplus population: emigration, advance into world markets, and expansion of territory. Emigration has been barred to us. World markets are being pushed shut by tariff barriers. What should Japan do when 2 of the 3 doors have been closed against her?
Japan controlled Korea and operated a railway into the Chinese province of Manchuria. In 1931, the Japanese army invaded Manchuria. The Japanese claimed they had to send the troops because the region was in a state of anarchy. They were only keeping the peace in order to defend their own economic interests in the area. Then they set up a puppet government in what they called Manchukuo. The slow-moving League took a year to make its report. Eventually it did decide Japan would have to withdraw. Disgusted, the Japanese walked out of the League of Nations. The League needed to move against Japan, but its options were limited. Manchuria was on the other side of the world. Trade bans and military action would only work with the support of the USA or USSR. Neither was a League member. As this cartoon illustrates, the action which League members did take was purely cosmetic. Japan went on to invade the rest of China. The Second World War had begun in the Far East. In 1935, Italy invaded the independent African state of Abyssinia. The League faced its toughest crisis to date. And again it seemed powerless to act with one of its own council members. Britain and France were worried that Germany was rearming. Their idea was to try and keep Italy's leader Mussolini on their side in case Germany made any aggressive move. Neither Britain nor France had a strong army or navy. They'd both been hard hit by the Depression, and they were both keen to avoid any action that might escalate into war or damage their own trade. So they were unwilling to take action against Mussolini. The League banned some trade with Italy, but the all-important oil supplies continued to flow. And crucially, the Anglo-French-owned Suez Canal, essential to the transport and supply of Mussolini's invasion, was left open. Most damaging of all, it emerged that Britain and France were involved in secret negotiations with the Italians. The deal that was put together was known as the Hoare-Laval proposals, after the British and French foreign ministers. The proposals offered 2/3 of Abyssinia to Italy without consulting either the League or the Abyssinians. Hoare later justified the action to the House of Commons.
We understand Italy's desire for overseas expansion. We stand for peace and will not abandon any reasonable chance that may offer itself for helping prevent a disastrous war.
When news leaked out that the League's 2 leading nations were negotiating against its wishes and behind its back, the League's plan for sanctions against Italy collapsed. Mussolini continued with his invasion and went on to occupy the whole of Abyssinia. The League was utterly discredited.